So we're going to have the two more speakers. One is Hassan Khan, the other is Senam, where is she? Okudzeto. Okay, so I just want to introduce the two speakers and then we can go into what they have to say. So Hassan Khan is an artist, musician, and writer who lives and works in Cairo, Egypt. Other than his well-established presence as an artist operating in the international stage, Khan has, through a consistent engagement with the field of cultural politics, both on the local, through lectures, panels, precise media appearances, and participating as a member of a highly controversial national jury and international level, through numerous published interviews, essays, lectures, and panel appearances, been at the forefront of the discussions surrounding the position of the artist, constant negotiations, and ethnic marketing and corrupt intellectuals. And Senam Okudzeto, she's a transnational artist, writer, scholar. She's living in between Basel, London, New York, and Accra. She did her BA at Slade School of Fine Art, UCL, her master's at Royal College of Art. She did postgraduate studies at the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program, and she has finished her PhD and is yet to defend it in cultural studies. She's been awarded a research fellowship from Harvard University. Her work has been shown in the US, Africa, and Europe, and she's taught on all three continents. She has also received a residency for the Studio Museum Harlem. She's received an award for the Pollock Krasner Awards and many other awards, and she's the founder of Art in Social Structures, which is an NGO providing educational initiatives and social development in Ghana through artists. Okay, so I will hand it over to Hassan.
Okay, is my voice heard? Okay. Well, first, I have to say that my talk will change a little bit because it feels a bit strange that I basically disagree with 99% of everything I've heard today. So it kind of will have an impact on what I say. First, I'm being given 30 minutes exactly, and I will try to stick to that time. I have a stopwatch with me. I have to apologize that this is going to be, in a way, a real mess. However, I cannot find any other format that I'm comfortable with when I was asked to comment on something like a roaming biennial, let alone a Pan-African one. Something so institutional, with the possibility of actually becoming institutional practice. The mess is here in my format not because it makes sense, but because it is the only way I feel like I'm able to maintain my position. Somehow I feel it is my responsibility to always maintain that position. I'm also totally uncomfortable with the position of commenting on something like that. I would be much happier if I was a well-paid consultant for an evil enterprise. Yet, yes, here I find myself, and I know my instinct is that, number one, the discussion itself has to stop or has to end somehow. And maybe polemics, are more productive. I'm going to read my abstract because it's a set of questions and I think they're quite relevant to this. So, is it possible that the discussion has maybe reached its dead end? Or is it a matter of finding the right framework for discourse where words can become charged and resonant? But what does that mean exactly? And how is it connected to the position the artist inhabits? Where are the imaginary intersections of interest, power, and the possible success of a cultural system? So where does that imaginary center lie? And why are we still speaking about it? And finally, what has an intellectual history of a local context have to do with all of this? So these are kind of a set of questions that I started with. So as I say, I begin with a polemic. Maybe it's simplistic, maybe it lacks complexity, but I feel it could be productive. The institution, this is where we start, because this is where we are. Whether it's a defunct state museum, a successful commercial gallery, an artist collective, or a roaming biennial, is a location that will always fight for its, will always fight, and probably, in a sense, a dirty fight, for its right to exist, and not just to exist, to actually, to do that successfully, it has to be involved in a process of normalization. Here it's meant to be that the institution, in a sense, disappears. It becomes kind of part of the very fabric of the system we're operating under. It produces cultural capital. That's kind of how that always happens. So, the institution, which always, by definition, views itself positively, in some cases as an educational agent, in some as the source of civilization, in others yet as a service. This kind of self-image is actually the format through which an institution manages to normalize itself. Now, when we come to speak about new entities, it's much more clear, this discussion. I mean, older entities that are already established, I think that process kind of becomes invisible, which means it has become successful. But when we come to speak about new entities, emergent entities as such, that these kind of dynamics are very, very obvious. So what happens is that all claims to critique or criticality are extremely important at that moment for an institution. It's kind of how it validates itself, it's kind of how it presents itself, it's kind of how it frames its very justification for existing. And because it's an institution, not in the case of the artist, things are different. And because it's an institution, which means that its capital is not only itself, which is where the difference between an artist and an institution could possibly lie, it means it's always kind of speculating on some kind of extra abstract value, whether it's financial or whether it's in terms of meanings. And therefore, it's extremely, this claim to criticality becomes extremely important at that moment, the genesis of a new institution. I mean, and I say it's a claim, and which means I'm kind of also questioning it, but even if it was truly operational, I would still find that lacking and problematic. Anyway, I'm going to, as I said, this is quite messy, and I have a lot of material, and I want to stick to 30 minutes. So I'm going to kind of jump at different parts and try to point to things that have to do with my own experience over the past 15 years, and also in terms of trying to open some of these questions. So I'm going to try to summarize this argument. What I have absolutely no doubt about is that there are pressures exerted on participants in cultural fields. This is obvious. These pressures differ again. First, you have the pressures placed upon operators. These range from the pressure to perform, to inform, to conform, to the goals set up by, for example, funding bodies, to adjust to expectations, in a sense, to promise, and therefore to always make claims. Then comes the pressure placed upon artists, or the figure of the artist itself. A figure, if I may say so myself, that I find actually quite intriguing. Partially because of how that figure partakes, or how that figure is in itself both, in a way, the source material and the product, even if we make a distinction between the artist and their work, but that the actual labor invested in the work is contained within that figure. Because of that, he or she inhabit a very, very specific and exceptional position within an industry. It's a position that I have to say differs greatly from other producers, whether it is a miner or a craftsman. We're also producing things of value. However, there is a difference with the artist because of something that maybe we could call aura somehow. Therefore, the institution, no matter how cynical it might be towards that artist, always has to, in a way, take the artist into account. And I think this is where the artist has some leverage. And I think that's a very important area to be conscious of and an important area to negotiate with. So you may ask, what has all this got to do with roaming biennials? But I come to that. I say, is it a matter of finding the right framework? And what I mean by that, and this is based upon also certain professional experiences, is how can we be in a situation where we are able to see a cultural operation that we deem to be successful? What is that success? I mean, that again differs from position to position. I can only speak from my position, and I will give an example here. I think it has relevance to all these discussions. Just right before I came here a week ago or 8 days ago, I was invited with a curator in Cairo to have a conversation, a 30-minute conversation at the Four Seasons Hotel in relation to the launch of the Arab Museum of Modern Art in Qatar, Doha. It's a very, very difficult situation because you are being, I'm aware of that, you're being implicated as a form of PR, basically a PR tool to validate this institution that is appearing on the horizon. Yet, at the same time, it presents possibilities because it gives you a space where you can exert a certain amount of power. And in the cultural field, like I think in all fields, we're constantly locked in different power struggles. My responsibility is to try to kind of maintain my position and my credibility, and at the same time to be able to access that power structure. I find that this is actually a responsibility, not just something extra. So how do you deal with a situation like this? How do you enter this charged place and not become merely another PR tool? I would say opposite to what has been said earlier, seriousness. It's not pleasure or fun, it's actually seriousness, an absolute intense seriousness that has the potential and the possibility of breaking through these kind of constraints that, first of all, have to do with institutional structures per se, and second of all, have to do with the interests that support these institutional structures. This is not, I would say that this is not to try to heroize. We did a very simple conversation about what a museum could be. We don't know what that museum specifically could do, but kind of a simple but serious conversation. But what was interesting is that we used this moment to be able to invite everyone in the Cairo art scene, let's say. And the Cairo art scene is a highly fractured, highly contentious place with many different power centers in constant warfare. They would never, they would rarely congregate in one place unless there is a center of, an attraction. In this case, a museum in the Gulf that is rich and will be powerful. That is the thing. The museum in the Gulf has no idea of all these nuances, has no idea what's going on in the Cairo art scene. They happen to invite me. I give them a huge list of people to invite, everyone who hates everyone. And by doing this, I ensure that all these people will go there because everyone has a stake being in this place on that evening. Now, what happens is immediately this space is tense, it's charged. Everything we say has meaning. This is what I'm trying to say. That's why I say, so does the discussion have to end? Does the discussion make any sense? And I believe it never really makes sense unless there is a certain level of tension that has to do with self-interest and with having a stake, with having a certain stake at hand. The discussion itself, I don't think we said anything that was incredibly brilliant. It was just kind of a serious talk about that. But because of the social structure, it turned this talk into something that is not merely PR. And by doing that, I personally, as the artist in that position, I would make that claim, maintain a certain credibility that is my own cultural capital. Now, I would like to move to another example of a similar situation. that is, but I can here speak about aesthetics. I will show a couple of examples. And when Mia Jankovic from CIC invited me to take part in this symposium, she was very interested in me talking about the 20th Youth Salon in Cairo, which I was a bit hesitant to do with, because it was, I think, first of all, it was an incredible experience for me to take part in this event. Bassem was also a member of a jury, and it was covered. It was at first, I have to explain what it is, but I first say something. It was covered by the press, by the local press, in an incredibly negative fashion, but it was also documented by some serious people in a way that made sense. So I felt that, also in discussion with Bassem, we felt that this event needed not to be spoken about too much, lest it is transformed into just another commodity to gain more cultural capital. So we kind of said we shouldn't speak about it. However, with Mia's kind of insistence and me discussing with her, and me also being here today, I feel like it actually makes sense to speak about this again. So because I think it relates to, if you say roaming ban, it relates to what kind of possibilities are actually there in doing a cultural event in a place that is not merely an event that recreates the same structures and kind of supports the same power structures, and in the end, therefore produces work that lacks the resonance and the tension that is necessary for a real, engaged, kind of even powerful, whether it's formal or critical, whatever, powerful experience that I personally expect out of my practice. And out of what I see, and it's what I want, actually, what I desire. So the 20th Youth Salon, the Youth Salon is a state-organized annual juried competition that is open to all artists in Egypt under the age of 30, and people send in, it's an open call, people send in their works, and works are selected and exhibited. This was the 20th one. There's been already 19 editions before. The Youth Salon, and maybe in the mid-90s, had quite an impact and was important because people found an outlet and it made some sense. But then it grew into this kind of monolithic, kind of very stale and very corrupt system that's part of a very corrupt system. Anyway, and the thing about the 20th Youth Salon, what was different about it is that the jury is composed of 9 people. 3 people were invited. One was myself, one was Bassem, and one was the Egyptian artist Wael Shawi. 3 people were invited who are outside that institution in the widest sense. These are, I would say we were people who are not considered to be part of that system. And now that's important. Why would that system invite outsiders? The only reason they would invite outsiders is because we do have the credibility and the cultural capital to validate a system that is already on the verge of collapse and needs to find ways to refresh itself. So we are put in a position where we are aware that we're being exploited, in a sense, to give them credibility and validity. So what do you do? Again, it's a similar thing like the Four Seasons, but in this case, it's related to the state. What do you do in this situation? How do you take the responsibility and the potential of a situation like that without letting it go and without becoming just someone who is again supporting that thing and kind of losing your own self-respect, basically. And so, I think what happened, it kind of went a bit out of control because, and it was also not so coordinated or so planned, but as members of the jury, I think we presented a certain level of seriousness again and a sense of having something at stake in which the other members of the jury who maybe would not have dealt with this jury in that sense kind of were won over with our sense of engagement. This is what I believe happened. And therefore, we were able to have a semi-functional real jury, basically. This is something that happens every year, and it's a sham. And for once, it seemed that there was some semblance of something real happening. And that created so much trouble and a huge backlash because I don't think it has nothing to do with the content. It has something to do with the mere gesture of being able to wrest power from an institution by just insisting on your own position. And by doing that, this had also repercussions in the media, etc. Okay, to cut a long story short, I want to show a couple of images because of one part in the exhibition that was actually done, because I think it demonstrates the possibility of working with that kind of local structure also. So we were a 9-member jury. The jury in the end selected something like 90 artists, which was a lot, but the average of this exhibition is 300 artists every year. So getting it down to 90 was, I think, a huge success in itself, and was the thing that was critiqued the most in the press. And then, while actually our position was not to actually put the exhibition together, because we're supposed to be the jury only, but me and my colleague Wael, who were actually there in the place, kind of took that position arrogantly, with no shame, with as much, like, by being total kind of assholes, we took the position that we can, and that was, I think, very significant, and we managed actually, also because people resisted, nobody wants responsibility, we managed to put the show up together. And in the selections, for example, there were 11 sculptures that we found extremely problematic, 11 sculptures that represented what I would say the worst in the worst in art practice in this place. I would say they're extremely mannerists, they're replications of an educational system where gesture is, and I am indebted to Bassem in this point, he has pointed that out to me at the time, where basically art becomes the mere replication of gestures that are where even the source of them is kind of lost. So people learn to kind of do the gesture, the shape, and that's what becomes valuable, and there is no real content, basically. And I don't mean here by content, I do not mean meaning. I just mean content in a much wider sense. So what do we do with these 11 sculptures that we have that we are very critical of? We have to include, it's also a political situation. In discussion, meanwhile, we decided to basically construct a space where these sculptures were shown in relation to other works by other young artists, which would kind of create, in a sense, a dialectical tension in the room, and open a further discussion about sculpture itself amongst visitors and maybe the media. And so, I mean, I show kind of what happened. So these are the 11 sculptures. Usually they would be displayed all over the exhibition space. We collected all the 11 sculptures and installed them on one long pedestal in one space, where they kind of, on a low pedestal, where they kind of become kind of evidence of a certain idea of what art is. By putting them together and by presenting them in this fashion, this idea is, we're also presenting what the idea behind it. However, we surrounded it by 3 works. You can see there's, at the far end there's a photograph, a very simple photograph by a young artist of a concrete slab in the street, which seemed to us to speak so much more about even the idea of a presence of an object, which is in a sense a sculptural concept. And on the left there was the work of another young artist who kind of, through his photographs, is questioning what an artist is. And I think that is, if we look at these sculptures, maybe what's missing about them is this kind of discussion of what an artist actually is. And at the far bottom, it's not very clear here, you cannot see it, but there's a very classical drawing of someone with a chalk kind of drawing on the wall. It's the basic gesture of art practice somehow. Now, you know, it seems very simple and it's very classical and there's nothing so radical about it. However, what I found interesting is that this room created a lot of comment, because some people were outraged by how could you treat sculpture in this fashion? How could you put it in this way? And therefore, I mean, basically, to cut a long story short, therefore I think it was actually successful. In a dialectical sense, it introduced into a system which is completely closed and completely based upon controlling controlling all the elements, and most importantly, controlling the definitions of things. It introduced into that system the possibility of breakdown and the possibility of another kind of discussion. And that was the important thing, but that was only possible through the investment of the artist and their ability to break rules and barriers through negotiations, through insistence, through refusal, which is, I think, also very important. Okay, that's one point. The second point I want to go to now is, again, I have 8 minutes, so I can touch on that point. The second point I want to touch on is about the emotional conditions of the artist himself. And this is something I dealt with in a video piece called Rant, in which a figure is kind of over 7 minutes speaking, says 7 sentences that are related to his or her, it's kind of an androgynous character, to their relation to a scene, the idea of a scene. And I wrote a text about this piece also, that I want to read bits of it, because I think that this is, to take it back to our discussion here about roaming biennials, this is maybe what's missing in any discussion of cultural events or art practice. What's missing is there are two things I think that are largely missing. One is a discussion of the artwork in a formal and deeply perceptive sense, which also takes into account, of course, art history, and takes into account the possibility of the work operating on many levels. And the other thing that's missing, that's a political discussion maybe, not just an art discussion, and I would like to separate them actually rather than bring them together. And what's missing is things like the conditions, and not just the material or financial conditions. That's something that goes around a lot because it has cultural capital, but the actual emotional conditions under which people operate. And I think maybe also in Bessem's show, there's an attempt to touch that in some ways. So I will read a little bit of this. In this scene, personal relationships are self-righteously confused with professional ones. Every participant is placed under the regime of moral conformity, in which the gestures of political engagement and high-level personal bickering become more or less the same thing. A demand is therefore made on every participant, every unwitting masochist, to perform the rituals of allegiance to the master order of this set. So, trapped in the spiral, we seek the glamour of a moment as our only salvation. The performances of belonging promise but never deliver. With pleasure, we watch friends, competitors, and enemies writhe in poorly concealed discomfort. The emotional conditions that rule the relationships built within that scene are by necessity polarized. We have a contradiction that is not just a moment, but a contradiction that is about structure rather than appearance. Thus, negotiation is always a key thing. That's a short paragraph. And I want to, this is the final paragraph of that text. I'm just taking bits from it. And the final paragraph is that, have you ever noticed, and I think this is very relevant to this discussion, especially the African context, have you ever noticed how the gatekeepers always want meetings to take place in their space? The gesture itself already determines where the subject who shares the space stand in relation to each other. One suspects a deep relationship between the generous gestures of liberal inclusion and the deeply loved myth of the nobility of our group endeavor. The members of this group love to foster the illusion that we are together, deeply involved in some collective humanist project. Maybe the first and most important step is to drop that extremely destructive illusion. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. Senam?
All right, hello everybody. It's very difficult to know what to show you because we've covered so much ground today. And I want to say that I kind of am grateful to Hassan for opening the scope of what it means to produce art in Africa. Because for me, one of the problems with this with the concept of this project as a roaming African Biennale was trying to somehow convey the sheer physical scale of Africa and all the different cultures and nations we have crammed in there, and then trying to find some sort of art, historical, or theoretical paradigm from which to launch this discussion. And sort of, you know, when you think that the landmass of Africa is as big as Europe and Asia combined, well, you thought of doing a roaming Eurasian Biennale. Logistically, it starts to sound like a nightmare. But when we think about Africa, for some reason, there's this idea of a unified cultural space. Pardon? Oh, sorry. Thank you. So there's this idea of this unified cultural space that somehow we have a greater ability to communicate with each other, a greater ability to travel regionally, and that somehow our cultural production is, is made on some common ground. It's not. And as I was listening to Hassan talking, I kind of I pulled up this ridiculous, oh, what happened here? Let me see if I can get this up for you. It is, oh, not opening. Sorry. It's a set of images that somebody sent me recently. And I don't know if you can see this. It's churches in the north of Nigeria. And, it's sort of, it's actually in Muslim territory, the Sharia in the north of Nigeria. But what I found hilarious was that this illustrates that we don't even speak English the same way in Anglophone African countries. The way in which we use English varies from nation to nation. So that, the emphasis we place on words, the semantics are totally different. And I think I want to go back to this morning's session because I think my colleagues raised a lot of issues that we need to keep reinforcing about the language barriers between African countries, the difference between Francophonie and Anglophone and Lusophone African countries. Run for Your Life International Chapel. What does that mean? I don't even know what that means. But clearly the congregation know what that means and they're motivated to go there. But one of the things about Africans is that we are dying for knowledge about ourselves and about each other. And also, one of the things that we've missed in this concept of a Pan-African roaming Biennale was we haven't talked about diasporan African-identified people, because there are millions of people the world over who are of African descent, who've never set foot in Africa, who are, mostly to the conditions of racism, desperate for information about Africa, desperate for cultural production about Africa. And if we were to do a roaming African Biennale, we must find some way to communicate with those people who are African identified. There is the Africa on the continent, and then there is the Africa that's constructed outside. The web is a really interesting place because there are all these constructions of Africa that happen on the web, and you have no idea where the people setting up these blogs and having these narratives are based. There was a project, I think I'm just going to sort of ramble. There was a project that happened in November last year, which, oh, please don't open Photoshop, which was curated, organized by Okayo Jikere, who's a Nigerian photographer who got 10 Nigerian young photographers and got them a minibus, and the idea was that they would travel through ECOWAS, through West Africa, to Bamako for the Biennale and make photo documentations as they went. And this is a really interesting project because I don't know if you guys are aware of ECOWAS, which is the Economic Union of West African States. There are, how many countries in ECOWAS? Thank you. And by the way, please interrupt me, everybody. I like having conversations. 16 countries in ECOWAS. And I think in 1990, ECOWAS set a new protocol which basically said that ECOWAS citizens can travel within each other's borders freely, with just an identity card. But actually ECOWAS was set up in the 70s to recognize that there would be migrant workers in Africa. And we had this, and actually what people don't realize, that ECOWAS was a testing ground for the EU. It was actually engineered as a kind of prototype for the EU. And the idea was that, we're migrant workers, we need to go where we follow economic density. And in particular, like Nigeria and the Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, were economic hubs. And ECOWAS recognized that there would be movement amongst these economic hubs in Africa, and so set up this fluidity of borders. So what happened was that this project was organized to kind of test that. So these 10 photographers got out of a minibus and then traveled across. It's a kind of Pan-Africanist project. Traveled across these borders, taking photographs as they went from Nigeria right the way across to Bamako, and had a bit of a tough time in several different places. And actually, they ended up getting arrested on the grounds of Kwame Nkrumah University in Ghana, taking photographs, because culturally Ghanaians are very offended when people take pictures. And, you know, unless you're at a traditional ceremony or at some sort of cultural event where people intend to be on display, if you take a photo in Ghana, I guarantee everyone on the street will come and tear your camera out of your hands. And so these Nigerians were at the university taking photos of, you know, one of the centers of Pan-Africanism, and a security guard got into an argument with them. They were locked up. And I was in Lagos about 3 or 4 weeks ago at a presentation on this project, and I kind of had to apologize on behalf of Ghanaians for their treatment. And, you know, it was really interesting because they basically talked about the difficulty they had testing the ECOWAS system, the difficulty at borders, the difficulty with language, and the fragmentation culturally amongst West Africans. So one of the things that's sort of come up again and again today is that to talk about a roaming African Biennale is, one can't engage with it theoretically without talking about it logistically, because part of the difficulty of talking about producing any kind of cultural project in Africa on this scale is a logistical one. South Africa has a very strong infrastructure. North Africa has a strong cultural infrastructure. West Africa has varied infrastructures. I mean, Senegal, I think, is pretty strong. Nigeria is strong in places, but it's a massive country of 180 million people. I mean, we could spend 10 years just taking art to 180 million Nigerians. Bissy Silva from CCA Lagos 3 years ago made a proposal for a roaming African Biennale. It's very interesting, like she also had a similar idea. And for her, the idea of the roaming African Biennale would be to take art to people who couldn't travel. So basically recognizing that, you know, an East African can't get a visa to get into West Africa very easily, that we have limited resources, we have limited finances, and that artists are usually completely broke. So that we would take an international show to them, and we would network them, and that we would find ways to support their production through this roaming Biennale. And it's very different from someone thinking of an international institution like a Biennale structure coming and kind of colonizing a space. It was actually a public service, the idea of serving art communities that were underprivileged. And I think that this is the key to somehow how this is just another photo from that project, how this might work. This is a photo they took in Nigeria. And this is the team. These are the photographers. I get the feeling they're in Mali. So anyway, but this is a lovely project, and Philippe Perrot is showing it at Kunsthalle Bern in a week on the 21st. If anybody's in Bern, do go and have a look at it. And I may have lost my train of thought. So what I want to talk about is, well, what are acceptable formats for doing a project like this? And I think Ngoni talked about actually funding institutions that are already on the ground. I think that that's somehow really valid, because one thing that we're forgetting is that as a society, internationally, globally, we are broke right now. We have just taken a series of never-ending hits financially, and there is less and less money in the system. And art is sort of something you do with surplus. Art is something that gets produced after you've taken your children to school, paid your fees in Africa, after you've filled your car with gas, after you've fed yourself. Culture is kind of what happens in that spare time, and we don't have so much of that right now. We don't have that many resources for that, or we have a difficulty convincing people. So how could we do something productive with art? I feel like art now either needs to enter a non-material space, or if it is going to take a material form, it has to do something practical, and Thembe also touched on this. So the idea is that, normally do a Biennale, we spend millions on these things. Millions on construction, millions on shipping. If you were to do this in West Africa, the logistics would be a nightmare. You don't know how much we'd have to bribe the customs officials to get the stuff out of customs, right? But imagine if, when you were doing a Biennale, you did a collaboration where you actually went in and created something for the community. You went into a direct conversation with the community. So I'll sort of put something on the table. Last year or 2 years ago, Gabi and Ngcobo invited me to speak at ARCO on Africans that have institutions. And I was talking about the NGO I set up 3 years ago, Art and Social Structures. And Art and Social Structures was set up as a donor member society. There are 40 members, but most of the funding comes from the artist members, and most of the artists are African artists. And the idea is that we do projects that support cultural production in Africa. And also the idea was that we didn't ask anyone for any money or any funding because we wanted to prove that artists are worthwhile. And the interesting thing is, once I got up on stage and said I didn't want any funding, the Spanish government contacted me and said, "We want to give you some money." And I said, "Oh, okay, thanks." So they gave me some funding, and I did a project on architectural heritage and preservation, talking about at-risk buildings in Ghana, historical buildings. And as a result of Gabi and Ngcobo and the Spanish government, Art and Social Structures was invited to renovate a city in Ghana earlier this year. So we're actually doing a civic regeneration project in a town called Sekondi, which is next to Takoradi. It's in the western region, and it's a particularly critical project because this town is in the middle of the oil region. And there are several oil companies who are dying to just buy the city up, bulldoze every building in the city, and turn it into a white enclave with armed security guards at the beginning and the end, and only people who work for oil companies can get in. And I'm working with the traditional leaders, the municipal authority, the government, several different donors like UNESCO, to try and actually protect this city and establish it as a historic civic center, because this is a city where the independence movements in Ghana happened. This is a railway station in the city, which I was told by citizens of the city is the oldest railway station in sub-Saharan West Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not sure. I have to research this. I think it's the oldest railway station in West Africa. It was built in like the 1890s or so. And it's been in disrepair for the last 20 years. So one of the long-term plans is to renovate this building. And this is where the labor movements started. And all the independence riots and struggles were located in this town, which is now fallen into disrepair. This is the railway tracks. One of the long-term fantasies for this project, at the moment we're working very closely with the community. It's about empowering the market women, empowering the fishermen who have no legislation to protect them in the case of oil spills. There have already been 4 oil spills since August. 4 whales have died. Whole fishing communities have lost their livelihood, and there's nothing to protect them. But the long-term plan is that once we've done what we can do to renovate parts of the city and do slum upgrading, we won't have the finances to approach everything. So the long-term plan was, well, what if we did like a Biennale aid, where we invited a culture project to come to the city, and then basically you might collaborate with a family, and in exchange for a room or the facade and some wiring, you might put the electricity into their home. You can do a cultural collaboration with that family, and we actually turn the city into the site. And that somehow we managed to do not just a culture project, but we actually managed to take the finances and the resources that we have for art and actually help bring some civic regeneration, employment, traffic, financial support to the community. I mean, the old railway station is actually being squatted by people. This is the view of the harbor, squatted by people who are owed money by the railways. The railways fell apart in 1982, but the people who live in the railway station have been owed money by the railways for 20 years, and so they kind of ended up having to squat the building. This is also an interesting city because Nkrumah planned a Pan-African Navy, and he wanted the Pan-African Naval Base to be based here. So in the distance you see a building, and that is a magnificent villa built by the Italian government to be the Pan-African Naval Base headquarters in 1960-something, I can't remember. This is a sign of what's to come. That's an oil rig off the coast. But just sort of imagine that a cultural project has the ability to kind of inject action into a community like this and protect them and offer them alternatives to the burgeoning oil industry, which at the moment everybody wants to join. So that's the kind of model that I wanted to kind of put forward. But then also I thought, again, logistically, we have to think about recycling labor because we have so few resources right now. So, like in a project like this, renovating the buildings would be recycling the labor that went into building them in the first place, which was most probably slave labor. But also, if we were to follow Ngoni's suggestion of actually, rather than doing a Pan-African Biennale, but putting money into the existing institutions. These institutions were hard-won. Places like CCA Lagos, they were set up against the odds. And you want to think about sustainability. All the people who set up these institutions did so with very little support in the beginning. If we were to take the concepts of a Pan-African roaming Biennale and actually make it roaming around these different institutions and giving them more support, more funding, more access, more of an audience, that would be a way of recycling the labor that's already been put into setting these institutions up. And, you know, because when I think about the idea of a Pan-African roaming Biennale, even if I say I don't want to be a part, I know that when you get to Ghana, someone's going to call me and I'm going to have to help you guys. And, you know, it's going to be really hard work. So no matter what, those of us who are the cultural producers on the ground in Africa, anytime somebody from the West comes up with some grand project, we're the people on the ground who network you, we resource you, we deal with all the logistics for you, we introduce you to the artists. We're tired. We're really, really tired right now. So again, the idea of smaller interventions, practical interventions. I had this fantasy that maybe, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put some of my work up so that you don't just think that I don't make art. You know, I'm up here for a reason. I earned it. But it's like a, where are we? You know those little digital film recorders? They're like the size of a telephone, and they shoot MPEGs so that you can shoot a film that's immediately uploadable. Imagine if we gave every single one of these institutions, you name 10, didn't you, Ngoni, one of these digital recorders, and we created a web platform where we had them upload cultural production from their regions, from their countries, from their spaces, and that there was a place where we could access this information. So that basically the Roaming African Biennale is a digital platform, and the roaming is us surfing the web. Because actually a lot of people are online in West Africa. They go to internet cafes, and they do research there. I mean, not everyone's online at home, but increasingly everybody uses email. So actually creating a searchable site could be a cost-effective way of recycling extant labor, creating more attention for the people on the ground who have the institutions, and still roaming around Africa, but without having the exhaust or the, you know, nightmare or the ecological nightmare of getting on airplanes and zooming all over the place, which is becoming unsustainable. So, have I said everything? Yeah, and I think that at the end of the day, what we have to do is think about serving the artists on the ground and actually finding ways to support them as our resources dry up. So for me, the aim of a Pan-African Biennale should not be necessarily creating new institutions, because right now the world is changing. We're in tremendous flux. And I want to resist, when I think about this sort of the radical change that West African countries go through every time we have an election and our governments change. You know, we usually, before an election year, the country's flush with money. After an election, everybody's broke because all the money's been spent on campaigning. And I could pretty much say that before an election year, everyone would be open for a cultural project, and after an election year, no one would support a cultural project because there would be no money in the system. So setting up something as rigid as a structure of a biennale that would have to reoccur, or any kind of recurring art project, is sort of setting a grid or a prison which it's sort of doomed to fail in some aspect. I feel like this project, or some of the principles of this project, are really great, but it has to be more fluid. Ideally, it would be something that was set up to be changed, something to evolve, something to change with the changing conditions of the world we live in globally, and also our changing finances, and something which takes all the right elements of communicating within the continent and across the continent, but makes it free. I want a Biennale without bureaucracy, basically. No bureaucratic structure, but everything else. So anyway, I don't know if I've talked for half an hour, but I think I've talked enough. Thank you.
So thank you, Senam.
Should I sit down?
Yeah,
Okay.
but 1 second, I need to...
Oh, should I get a file for you? Hold on, I forgot to say a program is to do silly things. Oh no, sorry, my computer is it's being weird. But it's this file.
So, I am a performance artist as well as moderating this session. And I just wanted to sort of add to what Hassan and Senam have said, and to see if we can actually take the discussion a little bit further, because Hassan was talking about sort of breaking through with a seriousness, breaking through institutions. And I think that this is something that is quite pertinent in Africa, because there seems to be a mentality that is very closed-minded, or it doesn't let for example, in Nairobi, there's a big coffee chain called Java, and you can go there and you can get American-style coffee, and you can get burritos, and you can get hamburgers, and all this kind of stuff. But you can't get, for example, you can't get rice with your hamburger, you know, or you can't get beans with your burrito, or I mean, you get beans with your burrito, but you can't get French fries with your burrito. Do you see what I'm saying? It's just this. There's a very rigid sort of mentality of how you can do things in Nairobi, and so I think that breaking through this mentality is something that needs to happen on the continent, because it's in a way it's what's pulling our continent down. And again, like Senam was saying, I think that as Africans, we really want to know each other, and we want to know who we are. And so I actually had, earlier this year, I devised this performance in the middle of Nairobi, where I was in this cage that I built, and I was sitting there in traditional Kenyan dress, and reading 21st century Kenyan magazines, sort of like the Cosmopolitan of Kenya. And so I just wanted to show you the series of the photographs. And I did this outside the building called the Kenyan National Archives, which is, it houses about 200 works of African art collected by our second vice president. And it's also a very interesting building, because a lot of Kenyans don't actually go there, and yet there's still this hunger to know who we are. So here I am sitting reading these magazines, and sort of as the performance goes on, people start looking, and what's going on, and they start talking to me, but I just continue the performance until there's masses of people, and people are so interested to see what exactly is happening. And I think this is a good example as to why, I mean, yes, it might not be a biennial, but it's a good example as to why we need to take contemporary art out into the streets of Africa, because people are interested. People want to know what's happening. So here we go. And they were asking me questions. I was being asked if I wanted lunch. It was it was all. There was a little girl that slid through the bars. Here we go. And then eventually the authority figure showed up. And here he is, he's asking me, what am I doing? And I actually had paid the equivalent of €500 to do the performance on the streets of Nairobi. I paid the municipality. And so I'm explaining to him, this is a good shot. And this woman in the burqa was very interested to know what was happening. And of course, he's giving his take on what's happening. And so I had to negotiate that I would leave as soon as possible. So I had to call my my pickup to come and get the cage. This is Nairobi. Here we go now. At this point, I was waiting for the pickup to come, but people were still very interested in what I was doing. And a lot of people were like, this is art, you know? And people knew what was happening, but they didn't, they wanted the tools to interpret what was going on. And I think this is what we need to be able to give these people. And before the pickup came, the police came. And they were outraged because they just could not understand what I was doing. And again, like I'm saying, this whole performance was devised to really look at the mentality of the state of freedom in Nairobi or even on the continent. And so here again, the police wouldn't let me leave. They were like, we don't understand, you need to explain yourself. And I was explaining, and eventually I got arrested. So, and actually thanks to my good friend Jimmy Ogonga, I got out of jail 8 hours later. But yeah, so but I just wanted to show you these because I thought it would be interesting for us for both Hassan and Senam to talk about why to sort of go beyond the logistics and to see what we can actually do on the ground. When we're on the ground, what kind of things are we going to actually produce if we're there? So like, I think what Senam was saying was the regeneration and actually helping communities. And as Hassan was saying, you know, just sort of, just the mere presentation of sculpture in a different form is something that again sort of will open someone's mind up. So I mean, what I would like for you, the both of you, is just to come up and talk a little bit more about that. Yeah.
With my hot corners.
Oh, sorry.
You just have to click on it.
Okay, you can close it.
Where's Hassan?
Yeah.
No, I mean,
Oh,
actually,
you can do it together.
I've almost stopped making work because I find it's a difficult time to make art. I really struggle to make art, so I'd much rather make society or, you know, do practical, constructive things because I've lost the inspiration temporarily. So, I mean, I've kind of taken that pressure off myself. I like supporting other artists and giving platforms for other artists, but I make 3 artworks a year right now, I think. I'm not really doing that much.
Okay.
And you're not meant to say that, but it's true.
Okay.
But if sorry.
No, go ahead.
But given the opportunity to have such a wide audience, if it wasn't biennial, what would be the things? I understand that you would do. I understand that you would that it would be sort of architectural development, or not on that scale, but.
Well, I think it would be. I mean, I kind of can only speak to the communities I know. So I know Nigeria and I know Ghana. And in both cases, it's really about supporting the artists there, networking them, giving them resources, giving them finance, and helping them in very practical ways, and creating the curatorial framework to challenge their work. But I mean, I'm increasingly at the moment, my modality is an administrator, so I'm kind of obsessed with logistics. But I think, you know, Hassan, you're a bit more esoteric. Maybe I should hand over to you.
I work like hell, and I make art, and I don't do social things. And this, what I explained, like this was for me a political action, being in this jury and stuff. It has nothing to do with my art practice. My art practice is a separate thing, and I work all the time, so it's different.
Okay, so but you were still quite opposed to a biennial, is what?
Well, I mean, I'm not opposed or with, or, I mean, I kind of had difficulty in coming to talk about something like this, you know, because I am suspicious of institutions by nature. But I don't say this, but I am, personally, but I don't say this as a statement, as that this, we have to be, you know, I just have to work out my own position. In relation to this, I'm aware of my position as an artist, and I use that, and this is what, but the problem with it is that you become kind of split between two things. One is your practice, your actual practice as an artist, and the other is your operation within the, you know, the world and the politics around that. And for me personally, I keep a very, very strong division between them, and I actually do not like them to meet somehow.
Okay, so as far as organizational and logistics go for the biennial, if there were to be one, you would be the artist contributing the work. You would definitely not be. Yes,
probably, or yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Sometimes, as I said, sometimes I do get involved in this other side, but I never claim it as an art practice.
Okay.
I do not claim it as an art practice. It's something else.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, you differ immensely.
Yeah. Isn't that good?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Oh no, I mean, I'm hoping for another question.
Okay, I actually wanted to open it to the audience, if that's okay. Yeah?
Yeah.
Were there any questions? Oh.
Yes, I just picking up what Hassan said about he's suspicious of institutions, and I think we are all. I mean, all the people I know in various places in Africa, including those who are running spaces, and I don't call those spaces institutions, because they are not. Even if they are meant to be, or maybe they will become institutions, they are trying to do it in a very organic way. That's why I was putting this list for and against, just the idea. About Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism, you have to understand it from a West African position. She will know what I mean. Maybe North Africa, I think that it's time for you to look down to South.
But don't forget,
Deeper.
Nasser was a big part of...
I know, but do they know that?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course I know that.
Maybe you, but how many people know that in Egypt? I did a project on this dialogue on both sides of the Sahara, and I was shocked when I was talking to artists in Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, just to realize that they know nothing about just recent history about the decolonization process and all these political networks that happened in the 50s amongst Africans. I was completely shocked because we learned that at school and they know nothing about it. But so this idea of Pan-Africanism and all these ideology that was laid down by Kwame Nkrumah is something West Africans have in common and cherish and respect a lot. And then the ideology vanished in the early 80s for a different reason. And I think that it's a new generation, and because we are in this buzz and fuss of 17 countries are celebrating their 50th anniversary of independence, and it means nothing, basically, and states are doing nothing but just doing parades, people are having a critical look at it. And it's interesting to see that it's not intellectuals or journalists, but it's creative people. I saw a lot of rap singers, visual artists, choreographers, who are trying to have a look on this journey of 50 years of is it independence or is it dependency? But Pan-Africanism is something we cherish a lot, but maybe it's something that is close to the heart of West Africans, and maybe because we have the same passport and we travel, we can cross borders, and because we all know by heart all the writings and discourses of Kwame Nkrumah, maybe that's why it's something we can understand, and maybe it's different from for you. And I would just want to say, because it's also referring to what Rashid was saying, why is this happening here? I have no idea, but we do a lot of meetings on the continent as well. And I know that I would also like Bassam to talk about where did he get the motivation of this idea of this Pan-African roaming Biennale. And I would like him to look in the south of the Sahara more often. I know that Europe is great, but if you have been in Africa for 1,400 years, remember that you are also part of this continent. And we network south of the Sahara North Africa is networking, but maybe it's time that we jump and go back and forth of the Sahara and know each other better. If you feel like it.
Oh, no, I mean, I agree with everything Ngoni says always, so.
Mia, you wanted to ask something, right?
Okay, while you're doing that, let me just say, I think that Pan-Africanism, though, do you think that it doesn't stem to the East as well? I mean, I think that there are not so many West Africans who come to East Africa, you know? So, I mean, this Pan-Africanism seems to be within West Africa. So, I mean, how Pan-African is that, you know?
Well, but when I'm saying it's close to our heart as West Africans, it's maybe because we achieved at least a minimum of things like having the same passport, free borders, and knowing that in pre-colonial Africa, if you take West Africa, it was the Malian Empire. That was today it's 5 different countries. When I go to Guinea, Mali, even Mauritania, I have family in all those places. So we're all like cousins.
Yeah.
And that kind of a tightness of people and communities within West Africa, I think it's only specific to West Africa. And it's very strong. People, we don't wear traditional clothes. We're wearing contemporary Senegalese fashion design, contemporary Ghanaian fashion design. And when I go to South Africa or to other places, they say, oh, I love your traditional clothes. No, for God's sake, this is not traditional. This is contemporary, but it's Senegalese. But that you will only find in West Africa, that people are wearing clothes that are made locally. Yeah. So I think, and it has to do with the charismatic figure of Kuma, who's based in Ghana. But it's true, we never interact with you. Is it a matter of language? Is it because it's too difficult to access there?
I think,
yes.
Just one second, I think this is a very dangerous way to approach such topics, to be honest. I think that we need to, I mean, first of all, the word Pan-African is a very wide, and all of that, I can say that this is not the point. But even if we want to look at things in terms of self-interest, in terms of what is productive for everyone within a cultural sphere, etc., I think it makes much more sense to really go down to like the details of that and to kind of see, like, for example, the word network is always thrown around as a positive thing. And the moment I hear network, I start to have a quite physical reaction to it. Because what is happening is that we're not looking at what these words mean in terms of actual practice. What does it mean when you say network? In my opinion, I'm quite critical, it means that there are groups of spaces in these different places that are in touch with each other, and by doing this, they are actually controlling the image of the whole area. And the idea of even producing an image is, for me, problematic. This is related to the nature of an institution in the first place. So institutions have to exist and can be very positive, but they have to be curtailed by a response to them. And I would say that artists have some responsibility, but not all, because not all artists are interested in this, and they don't have to be. But there has to be some kind of response on different fronts, and then the discussion, in my opinion, doesn't become about whether we can have a Pan-African biennial. It might be a productive thing. I'm not saying it would not be, and it might be good to see what's going on and on, but I'm just saying that the terms have to be different. We can't discuss, in my opinion, we can't discuss them in those terms.
Yeah, but just don't be too paranoid about power control. I know there is power control and it's a power game, but in our terms, when we say network, it's just about sharing experiences, because that's the way they do it, and that's the way I collaborate with them. That's the way we exchange ideas and advice. And these small initiatives that are happening in Africa, that's why it's so organic, because they are controlling actually nothing. And they are not trying to control or to become superstar curator or superstar artist. And that's why it's fine. And that's why also when I first was contacted about this idea, I was saying, this is ridiculous. Do we need another? I'm already struggling with the bureaucrats of the Dakar Biennale, and now you're trying to tell me about an institution that will have to sustain, and then that institution that has to be sustained will have to sustain a rooming biennale. This is already a nightmare. I don't want to think about it. No, I know, but that's just the first thing that comes to the mind. But as you said, there's different options that we're discussing. I don't have any answer, and maybe after thinking, and maybe the task force will go deeper and then find new ideas. But my first impulse was to say, these people are mad. What do we already need that, knowing that we're already struggling with these bureaucrats that look at the Cairo Biennale. For many years, it was something that wasn't really working. And knowing at the potential of this great city and all the artists who live there. Hopefully things are changing now. So it's not, when we say network, it's in an African way, we just,
Yeah.
But we can have maybe.
Yeah, I know, but we're talking. It's very strange that we've been talking about all this in a non-African city, as Rashid said. But we have to start somewhere and see where we go, and come to Dakar, please.
Mia was going to ask a question first, I think.
Questions as well. Yeah, I would like, just because I think that we touched on some things that are super, super relevant to the idea of a Pan-African roaming biennial, if we decide to start thinking of one. I think a key issue here is power that got brought up, and an uneasiness and a pleasure in the use of power. The sort of very vague tension I perceive in these discussions is Hassan speaks of seizing power in a certain moment, and other people are talking about empowerment, which tends to be about empowering an audience, providing access, providing infrastructures where there are not. And there's a tension between these two inclinations, maybe. In this opposition, we started talking about accessibility projects, about projects where you might, rather than make the artwork that, I don't know, you might naturally make, you might instead provide some sort of facilities in a local situation. These projects, which I think have enormous value. But when you 100% reject the possibility of doing a self-indulgent, expensive, dream artistic project, and you outright reject that because you say, hey, we haven't got the resources, then yes, you do wonderful community projects, you do wonderful accessibility projects, but you don't actually know in the first place what your original inclination was. And it's that position of infrastructure it's that position of infrastructure that we're put in this position of not actually knowing what inclination we would follow if we had the resources at hand. And from that, I want to just quickly move on to the notion of the resting of power from a stable situation. And I think that's where this point about taking power becomes important. This isn't taking power in terms of like suddenly wanting to become king of the castle and impose an artistic dictatorship over the world, but about acknowledging that power is temporary and unstable. So what I was reflecting on is we have an urge towards stability within communities, within art audiences, and we have an urge towards instability within the institutions that control us and put power on us. And when I say institutions, I just want to add a note that I have spent the last 11 months losing sleep over the fact that I want my institution to become stable. So I'm not against this either. So the question for me is not about being stable or unstable, but about where we apply instability and where we apply stability. Who we want to render uncomfortable. I know exactly where in Egypt who I want to render uncomfortable, who I want to get some temporary power from, and who we render extremely comfortable, and who we actually allow people to have some privileges of access, some privileges of expectation towards resources, artwork, and all the pleasures that brings. That for me is a super key question for when we're thinking about a Pan-African roaming biennial. And finally, addressing Atto, for me, your work was exactly about rendering people uncomfortable within the systems that they are used to. I don't think it matters if that work was in public or not. The fact was you identified as an overly stable space that you rendered unstable in a very useful way. So I interrupted for quite a long time, but I think that's a super important point to be bringing away from this discussion. And now I'll let Bassam speak, or somebody from the audience.
Let me just jump in, because one thing I want to say is that in terms of not wanting to recreate a big Western institution, I'm speaking from someone who had a career in America, turned my back on that, and then went back to Africa, because I didn't want to be involved in the Western art world. I'm less and less interested in the commercial gallery space, in the Biennale, in things like that, and I have an informed position with the work I do in Ghana. And so I think that, you know, all of us who have these institutions have kind of made informed decisions to turn inward towards our communities. And we no longer think that these structures are sustainable, and, you know, and so that's something that you